Salutations, fellow nerds. I'm Rick Y, the Wise Guy, and today is January 22nd, 2025. Trump has managed to pardon all or most insurrectionists guilty of violently storming the Capitol and beating police officers as a way to try and stop the lawful transition of power after Donald Trump was voted out of office. This is now resembling, strikingly, events that have already come to pass, and unfortunately not only does our citizenry seem all too complacent, but our government does as well, to the very real dangers that are currently facing the nation. So if you dig news, history, or just humorous American hogwash, sit a bell. Take your shoes off. I'm going to go over some interesting historical events that were far too reminiscent of the current body politic in many ways, but I would like to cover something first before I'm entirely written off by the big eye rolls from those who are going to refuse to listen to this. First, the Overton window, which is a way to approach politics and shifting interests in the public sphere. This was developed by a conservative think tank in the 90s and developed by a man named Joseph P. Overton, who never expected his work to become as big as it is today. All he was doing was trying to explain to potential donors what the point of a think tank was, which is good because that's what he worked at diligently for years. He used a graphic with schools and public investment. It was a sliding scale where on one end, the option of zero public investment in education, all the way to the other end, which was compulsory indoctrination in government schools. He clarified that since the public would never accept either extreme, what he called the window of political possibility arose, wherein he showed that you can use it to help move public narratives away from grassroots campaigns, and what people don't get is that it's a descriptive term and not a tactical term. Shifting it doesn't mean proposing extreme ideas to make less extremes more digestible. Glenn Beck really screwed that up, and the public perception of that concept with his book called The Overton Window. All the real Overton Window does is explain how and why things tend to fall in and out of public favor. That's it. One part of the range between extremes is achievable. The second and arguably most important concept that I want to cover for this is Godwin's law, which isn't a law so much as it is an internet adage asserting that the longer an online discussion continues, the probability of comparison to Nazis or Hitler approaches 1. And this has been used by self-described Nazis in the past to hide their beliefs, as it isn't an official logical fallacy so much as it's an observation. It was an experiment in memetics to address the ubiquitous nature of Nazi comparison, which actually trivialized the Holocaust. However, the person who actually developed this cynical observation specifically stated in 2023 that all comparisons for Trump and MAGA being a new form of American Nazism is pretty apt. When Trump mentioned immigrants poisoning the blood of our country and called them vermin, even Godwin pointed out that there's a clear thematic strategy going on. While approaching entities that aren't so overt in their acceptance and adoption of white nationalism, Godwin's law may be applicable to a degree, but to write someone off for making observations in regards to the current executive officer and his base of supporters because of their knowledge of Godwin's law leaves a glaring blind spot on their behalf, as they demonstrate that they intellectually stop processing information or warnings that could be obvious or outright blatant. To try and lean on Godwin's law to justify positions in itself is a fallacy, and the creator of it has gone on to make that very clear. But what I wanted to talk about was not so much the intricacies of human speech or online discussion. I wanted to get those two troll tactics out of the way ahead of time so as to refrain from anyone confusing the idea that I'm not aware of those concepts. I'm very well aware. Thank you ahead of time for your thoughtful input. Now, tell me if you hear any resemblance or similarities as I speak about some interesting events that occurred in the early to mid-20th century. In November of 1929, Germany was struggling under a government known as the Weimar Republic, and during this period they were trying to pay imposed reparations after their defeat in World War I, which was economically untenable. Because of this, the German people were desperate for a change in the system that they saw as flawed. Their daily lives were more expensive, and inflation was at a pretty steep rate when the government then began to print money to offset these costs. Political tensions were high, and the German people wanted change. As a response, the new Nazi party leaders Adolf Hitler and Erich Ludendorff, along with other Kampfbund leaders in Munich, Bavaria, led a failed coup against the government in a beer hall that they were eventually surrounded by authorities and apprehended. Hitler himself actually escaped arrest initially and let his followers kind of take the majority of the burden until he was finally caught up with in the countryside 2 days later. This was called the Beer Hall Putsch. Undeterred, Hitler was released from prison after 9 months and spent his efforts in obtaining power through more legal fashions. As such, he ramped up the Nazi propaganda machine that would eventually become a locomotive. Once Hitler rose to power, a coordinated effort to remove members of government who weren't loyal to the party's demands or agenda was put in place, called the Gleichschaltung. This was only after consolidating power around himself from members of the parliament. And as tensions heightened, the Reichstag, which is the equivalent to our Capitol building, was burned. A young Dutch communist was arrested for the crime, and the Nazis spent the final frantic hours of the period pushing out anti-communist and anti-leftist propaganda, which created fear and doubt of anyone not sufficiently loyal to the movement. Specifically, a man named Hermann Goering created an atmosphere of panic through the propaganda machine and turned the public against what was seen as an enemy from within: communists. And 4,000 people were subsequently arrested. Immediately after the fire, President Hindenburg signed an emergency decree for the protection of the German people. This suspended all democratic processes within the Weimar Republic and declared a state of emergency. Given the anxiety and uncertainty following the Reichstag fire, German voters flocked to the Nazi Party after having been convinced that alienated minorities were the cause of all of their suffering. They saw control and security under the swastika over the perceived fears of oppressors and people with little to no power. Those who didn't outwardly vote for the Nazi Party simply chose to sit the election out due to fear of subjugation. In March of 1933, Hitler passed the enabling law which would give him power of rule by decree, then having laws passed through the pesky chambers of their legislative bodies. This consolidated power and allowed for Hitler to dictate law by executive order rather than democratic processes of debate. After promising to protect the interests of the Christian religion of Catholicism and winning over the faithful, challenges to his rise conceded, and support gained for his rise to the complete and utter dictatorship of Germany. Hitler and the Nazi Party created an atmosphere of paranoia. He promised to solve all of the problems that he had convinced Germans of, that being the targeting of minorities as a cause of all of their lives' problems. Using this fear and anger and paranoia and xenophobia, Hitler then appealed to the pious and faithful and also promised to let them sit at his table and share power. And using faith above all forms of critical thought and logic, they were convinced of a new religiously motivated state. The church saw an opportunity for power and, in turn, sold everyone out for their own earthly goals. Then, the night of the long knives. This was a purge of the leadership and of political opponents to Hitler through arrest and violence, wherein 150 people would be murdered and hundreds more would be apprehended. I'm not going to tell you where to draw the lines between the two similarities and eras here in politics, because I'm fairly certain you all are smart enough to see them yourself. Currently, Project 2025 is underway. Quietly, as MAGA leadership and Trump have been meticulously firing career experts to replace with more sycophantic members. As acts of odd behavior and outright violence inevitably occur, be wary of folks who will try to move their goalposts to seem less extreme. One of the objectively worst parts to this whole era is how many otherwise decent people have turned a blind eye to abhorrent acts and words, all just as a means to consolidate power in a party and behind a singular man. I sincerely hope that I'm wrong when it comes to the clear and present reflections of today and of 1930s Germany. But if I'm not, I sincerely hope enough of you are willing to resist it. Some of y'all think it's just trolling and it's just edgy humor, and I guess I have to ask, when the billionaire who's set to screw you over financially is giving Nazi salutes to the American flag to a cheering crowd, when is it no longer funny? When are you going to grow up and start taking things seriously around here? Anyways, if you've made it this far, thank you. I appreciate it. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. It does a huge service in making sure these messages get out. Yeah, I'll come back now. You hear?